Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to Politics and Society in Colonial and Postcolonial Nigeria, a panel of the African Studies Association Conference in Philadelphia, November 2022. My name is Dr. Ndubueze Mba, Associate Professor of African History in the Atlantic Ward at the State University of New York at Buffalo. I will be moderating as chair, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Oliver Coates is a Bai Fellow and Director of Studies in History and Politics at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge. He's also an Associate Researcher at the Institut du Monde Africain at the CNRS in Paris. His research interests focus on Nigerian cultural and intellectual history, particularly with reference to Nigerian relations with Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Coates will be presenting on a paper titled West African Representations of South Asia During World War II. Dr. Coates.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak today about material that is from a journal article which is currently being revised. That's not necessarily always like a natural ground for a conference presentation, but I'm going to include a small fragment of that article. The wider article and project that this comes from is a survey of West African activities in India during the Second World War, which in one incarnation is a geographical survey, which is an idea that I feel quite committed to, because I think it's important to delineate African activities in different areas of India, because they weren't the same in different parts of the subcontinent. And another iteration of the article is a thematic structure, so the key themes in African engagement in India. But in this case, I'm going to focus on two moments in particular, one in Calcutta, a large city on the top of the Bay of Bengal, which was Africans' final stopping off point on their way to Burma during the Second World War. And the second, if I have time, outside Madras, now Chennai, in the state of Tamil Nadu, then Madras Presidency in southern India. So my first section, the familiar and the strange in wartime Calcutta. Calcutta was visited by many Africans immediately before their onward journey to Burma during the Second World War. Troops arrived in Bengal following a train journey from Bombay that often lasted a week, and the city that greeted them on disembarkation had been ravaged by disease, as more than 1.7 million had died in the Bengal famine of 1943, and there had been 50 to 90% crop losses in Bengal during 1942 and 1943. And it's in this context, from the end of 1943, that West Africans begin to arrive in Bengal and Calcutta. This stop in Bengal would be Africans' final glimpse of India before continuing to the active theatre of combat in Burma, so on the other side of the Bay of Bengal. And their responses to Calcutta vary considerably between enthusiasm for the colonial modernity on display in Calcutta, including large department stores, elevators, streetcars, and cinemas, and the monumental culture of Calcutta, including Raj-era monuments from 19th century British occupation of India, as well as travel logs and travel analyses. The sources for this potentially partly come from the English language lessons given to West African soldiers stationed in India, which encouraged them to write their experiences in essay form, particularly structured around excursions to cities. So there's an archive of African travel writing created by soldiers who were learning English during the war. And these preserve and document subaltern colonial perspectives on Asia that are otherwise absent from the colonial archive. So, for example, to take some cases of individual African responses to Calcutta, for Nigerian soldier Samuel Babatunde Sile, Calcutta was to prove more familiar than he might have expected. In 1944, he was among a group of soldiers sent to watch a parade of African-American troops in the city. So there were a number of contingents of African American troops that were based in Calcutta during the war as well. And what might at first have seemed an utterly alien spectacle, so there was no direct connection with West Africa, soon changed in meaning when Sile spotted among the passing American soldiers his cousin, Sir Tunjay Thompson, who was serving in the American Army. Thompson had been a merchant seaman during the war. He'd worked his way across the Atlantic Ocean in the late 1930s before falling out of touch with his family back in Nigeria and enlisting in the US Army, where he'd ultimately become stationed in Bengal during the war. After seeing his brother in a parade in Calcutta, the two men shared a celebratory dinner and a trip around the town. So there's some West Africans who had family networks in South Asia, even though those family networks were structured by what we would call today the Black Atlantic. And so at a basic level, there were some West Africans for whom Bengal became intimately familiar because of the mobility of wartime military service. Other soldiers recorded their sightseeing experiences in Bengal. For example, one soldier wrote, "Immediately after we arrived, I was first attracted by the buses, cars, and personal traffics, which was too much complicating to me," quote unquote. And another reflected on the entrances to Warren Hastings Government House in Bengal, quote unquote, with its architecturals, although we do not enter but one exterior, which was dim, solemn, and terrible to me. In some open fields in the city, I saw statues of some great men on horses' backs, standing in memory of their names and braveries. Oh, how I drew my breath when I entered, because he's describing the cinema is a Palladium building. The most interesting part of the film that he saw in the cinema was the 8th Army in advance to Rome and the havoc played by the RAF on the enemy occupied territories. So in this kind of text, not only is there a travel analysis of Calcutta by the soldier concerned, but there are also other dynamics within that as well, such as a display of learning about architectural styles or about the wider events of the war, which goes back to the educational kind of motivation and situation in which these essays were written. Some of the focuses in the essays are quite different. So, for example, aside from descriptions of Calcutta's cityscape, several soldiers wrote an account of visiting the zoological gardens in Calcutta. One man wrote, "I never thought that an area of 1 square mile can be glotted only for the training of wild beasts. One will be interested to hear the names of animals and birds that I saw there. I saw different monkeys, turtles, antelopes, porcupines, wolves, camels, alligators, zebras, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, and a giraffe. I never realized he goes on to say that about the animals that he saw, the names of the animals that he saw, he didn't realize before. And he wrote, it is no exaggeration to say that a rhinoceros can last the whole of 5 Gold Coast Company, which was his military unit, for a fortnight's meal. So he had his eye on the practical uses that the animals of the Calcutta Zoo could be put to. Later in the essay, he describes different birds that he saw and the phenomena of the zoo itself. So as Professor Ajarinto, who is around somewhere, reminds us in his books, these were a familiar phenomenon in large cities in colonial West Africa, but not other than that in this period. And so the whole spectacle of the zoo itself would be an unusual and novel experience. Some West Africans experienced bombing raids in Calcutta during 1943 and 1944. The soldier Isaac Fadayobo experienced a Japanese bombing raid in the city. And other soldiers commented on their own self-perception of being a minority, being African in a city mainly occupied by Indians and British service personnel, and their sense of minoritization in, for example, attending cinema screenings or walking in the street of Calcutta. So there's a kind of different range of subjectivities communicated in soldiers' essays. I'm going to move now to the second example that I wish to use, which is the meeting between African soldiers and Mahatma Gandhi at a racecourse outside Madras in the January of 1946. So these soldiers were remaining in India after the end of the war and were effectively kind of mothballed because the British had not provided shipping to return them to Africa, and they were stationed without any thing to really occupy them in southern India for just over half a year at the end of the war. And in this time, a group of African soldiers visited a racecourse outside Madras, where Gandhi was giving a rally to the low-caste group, the Harijans, that he was campaigning about in Madras in this period. And several different accounts of the meetings between the group of soldiers and Gandhi survive in different sources. In Gandhi's official biography written in the early 50s, a dialogue is reproduced, which is almost certainly artificial, between Gandhi and the African soldiers, that presents Gandhi in a very instructive and kind of uncritical light, and includes Gandhi giving advice to African soldiers about how they can transfer his own teachings back to Africa itself, but in a way that is replete with assumptions about the supposed backwardness of West African colonies in comparison to India at the time. A number of newspaper stories in West Africa at the time also covered this meeting, as did the war veteran Marshal Kebby, who was interviewed by the BBC World Service in the late 1980s. So Kebby recalled, for example, I had decided to go to Madras and to see Mahatma Gandhi, the ruler of India. The day I took a pass, and in the morning I took the train to Madras, and the racecourse at Madras is one of the greatest things I did as a soldier, so the trip to see Gandhi. The crowd was more than 1 million at the racecourse. I was the only one, the only soldier amongst them, the only black soldier amongst the whole lot. I waited patiently, people were looking at me, they didn't know why I was there, I was not armed. So when Mahatma Gandhi came, I did my best to go nearer to the grandstand, where I greeted him with the military salute. Then he was responsive. I asked him, what are you going to do for Africa now that India is going to be free? And he said, as in Gandhi said, India will not do anything for you, but India will give you her moral support on condition that your people, your leaders, fight the British non-violently. Because he didn't like violence, I say, this is Kebby, all right, that was a bold step I took in India, and I love taking that step, something out of the way. So I mean, Kebby's account of the encounter is not dissimilar in its unreliability from Gandhi's official biography, in that it presents a self-dramatizing account of this meeting that is part of Kebby's own self-fashioning as a man distinguished by his military experience in Asia. But this example provides us with a concrete case of interaction between relatively non-elite West African individuals and a senior Indian politician, of the kind that British military and civilian officials were paranoid about and speculated about, but it's very, very rarely documented in existing literature. So even this meeting, for example, appears in some surveys, like Killingrave's survey of African military service in the Second World War, but only as an event that is supposed to be not documented in very much detail. But once you analyze the accounts and narratives of the event itself, it enables some speculation and some modeling of the intellectual exchange that was possible between relatively subaltern colonial subjects and nationalist elites in India, and one that occurred across boundaries of racial prejudice and of assumptions about Africa on the part of India's nationalist elite at the time. So in the paper, in this presentation, I've chosen two examples to illustrate different forms of intellectual engagement with India during the war. On the one hand, the touristic itineraries of soldiers in Calcutta, ranging from shopping to going to the theatre or cinema to looking at historical monuments and seeing zoo animals. And on the other hand, Indian nationalist encounter with African soldiers, and perhaps an attempt to conscript African soldiers into a narrative of Indian nationalism that they do not necessarily fit within. And those two different examples highlight the diversity of African presence in Asia at this period that is not possible to reduce to a military history of their military activities in Burma, as is sometimes the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coates. You were right on time. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Pelumi Fola Jumi. Pelumi is a doctoral candidate at Louisiana State University. His research focuses on African literature and African diaspora popular culture. His paper today is entitled The Nigerian Urban Cities, Memories of the June 12, 1993 General Elections. You're mute. Pelumi, you need to be on mute.
Thank you for introducing me. I'm grateful. My name remains Pelumi Folajimi. I teach in the Department of Dramatic Arts of Obafemi Awolowo University, but I'm currently, being trained. I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now I'm in Louisiana State University. And my presentation today focuses on the June 12 general elections in Nigeria. June 12, 1993 general elections. Again, the title, The Nigerian Urban Space, Memories of the June 12, 1993 general elections. Before I go into my paper, I just want to thank Professor Said Aderiton for the opportunities he has created for many people to be able to express themselves intellectually and also share their thoughts, research, and discoveries to different people in different parts of the world through the platform of Legal Studies Association. Professor Aderiton, thank you so much for your commitment, your contributions, and your impacts. Again, the title of my paper, The Nigerian Urban Space, Memories of the June 12, 1993 General Elections. I argue that though it is an event in the past, the phenomenon of the Nigerian June 12, 1993 general elections is never a thing of the past. It is ever present and continuous as its legacies and lessons remain integral and inextricable components of Nigeria's daily political realities and ideals, even if paradoxical in its manifestations. That's my argument. Rita Nnodim engages the subject of June 12, 1993 general elections from the viewpoint of Yoruba oral poetry, Ewi. She explicates the impact of the elections on the production of Ewi. Her elucidation reveals, and I quote, Olatubosun Oladapo produced a cassette immediately after the death of Abiola, the elected presidential candidate who died on the 7th of July, 1998, while awaiting his impending release from prison to which he had been confined during the Abacha military regime after the annulment of the presidential elections on the 12th of June, 1993, that would have brought him to power, end of quote. On this cassette, Nnodim explicates further, and I quote again, Oladapo poetically expresses the public outcry. Oladapo poetically expresses the public outcry and dissatisfaction with the socio-political state of the country after Abiola's death. Like Nnodim, Oyeniyi Okoye treats the theme. I want to be sure my audience can still hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Like Nnodim, Oyeniyi Okoye treats the theme of June 12 elections from the perspective of Ewi. According to Okoye, the use of Ewi assumed a new dimension in the early 1990s, right from the political campaigns preceding the general elections of 1993, through the annulment of the results of the presidential election, to the detention and death in controversial circumstances of Moshood Abiola, the presumed winner of the June 12, 1993 presidential election. End of quote. Okoye explicates that the annulment of the June 12 elections was discernible for an increased output of Ewi. The outburst of Ewi, Okoye elucidates, and I quote again, probably steered pan-Yoruba consciousness, the most in post-independence Nigeria. End of quote. I engaged the discourse of June 12, 1993 general election from the perspective of prose fiction. The Nigerian city space is a place of politics and memory creation. Big Nigerian cities such as Lagos, Akure, and Abuja, among many others, are known for huge political practices which go into record as historical events which form significant parts of our memories. The events of June 12, 1993 general elections remain fresh in the memories of many of us, including me, the presenter. I was alive then, so I can tell the story. Though the millennium children born in the 20s, in the second millennium, cannot boast of such memories. Nigerian cities, often reputed for modernity and urbanization, constitutes the platform on which political performers demonstrate their mastery of political games. June 12, 1993 presents us with a political history whose traumatic outcome remains a cogent part of our memories. There is no doubt that socio-political encounters of the world, especially Nigeria, create a creative impetus for Nigerian writers. Indeed, the politics of Nigeria often influences the thematic preoccupation of the novelists of the country. We see the veracity of these thoughts in the works of Ayobami Adebayo, Ifeoluwa Adeniyi, and Chigozie Obioma. The works of these three writers give us the memories of the June 12, 1993 political events, since prose is a literary genre that creates and recreates memories. Adebayo's Stay With Me is a novel which not only portrays the family story of Yejide and Akin, but also the political and socio-cultural encounters of the Nigerian people. As the novel treats the domestic experiences of Akin and Yejide, it's oscillating between the city of Ilesha and the city of Lagos, among other cities in Nigeria, gives us a deep insight on the Nigerian experience of June 12, 1993 general elections. On the bank of the river, Ifeoluwa Adeniyi gives an account of the post-June 12, 1993 general elections. The novel reveals Lagos as a coastal city where a lot of political activities take place. The city of Abuja, as the political headquarters of Nigeria, the political capital of Nigeria, also features in the novel, which reveals and condemns the silence with which the annulment of the elections is treated by the same people who are supposed to be unequivocal and vociferous. in a fight against the injustice perpetrated by the military government. Obioma's The Fisherman, set in the city of Akure in Ondo State, Nigeria, reviews the experiences of June 12, 1993 general elections. The novel portrays the moments of MKO Abiola's campaigns, the moments of the election on the 12th of June 1993, and the ignominious annulment of the elections. It also portrays the incarceration. It also portrays the incarceration of the widely judged winner of the election and the death, martyrdom of the political hero, MKO Abiola. What we see in the novels of Adebayo, Adeniyi, and Obioma, which compels our participation in the events of the works, are in proximity with our encounters and experiences. Significantly, our political catastrophe, the June 12, 1993 elections, which were annulled by the military government. Pius Adesomi and Chris Dunton acknowledged the international attention earned by third-generation Nigerian writers. Obioma's novel and that of Adebayo enjoyed a significant international attention, perhaps more than Adeniyi's, which was published in Nigeria. In the works of Adeniyi and Adebayo, we see the realization of the position of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, who maintains that the intellectual woman must not disown the intellectual task entrusted to her. Walter Benjamin asserts that when the social significance of art is revolutionized, the art is based on the practice of politics, not ritual. These thoughts may be controversial, the thought of Benjamin. The thought of Benjamin may be controversial because it is possible for a revolutionized work of art to be ritualistic, as rituals may also be political, depending on certain factors and possibilities. The viability of politics in art, as Benjamin suggests, remains an unassailable thought, nonetheless. Politics is salient in the novels of Adebayo, Adeniyi, and Obioma, which are works that artistically preserve the memories of the political atmosphere of the 1993 Nigeria. Adebayo's novel does not treat the regime of General Babangida in isolation. She engages his regime in relation to other military governments in Nigeria. The plot of our novel is set majorly between 1985 and 2008. This helps the novelist to narrate some significant sections of the story around the regime of General Babangida, and particularly the June 12, 1993 elections, creating memories of trauma and nostalgia that pervaded the political experience. The novel reveals the doubts and mistrust that surround the election, even before it takes place. Adeniyi's novel tells us about the chief of defense and the generals who are apprehended by the military government. They are to be punished severely by the government for the coup de plot. There is a rumor that the generals plan a coup as a demonstration of solidarity with... You have 2 minutes to go, please. How many minutes? 2 minutes, please. With the man of the people, the man of June 12. Indeed, the novel gives one a memory of the trauma that was prevalent in the political atmosphere of Nigeria in the 1990s. And I conclude, Yoruba oral poetry was used to combat the injustice of Babangida, as the studies of Nnodim and Okoye explicate. Indeed, the city space was an important factor in the fight against the military dictatorship which annulled the June 12, 1993 general elections. Human rights activists such as Wole Soyinka, Gani Fawehinmi, Femi Falana, Dipo Fashino, among many others, joined the struggle of resistance, but Babangida was irrevocable in his notorious determination to glamorize injustice, which Abiola fought till he was politically assassinated, as he was widely known to have been poisoned by those who constituted themselves as his political enemies when he was in detention. The culture of fighting for justice remains one of the pivotal legacies of June 12, 1993 general elections. Fighting for justice is a culture which the Nigerian politics of the contemporary and future times must celebrate if we are to attain the status of politics without bitterness, which has the possibility of earning us total democracy. As the June 12, 1993 experience epitomized, the current political culture of Nigeria must fight against every form of political injustice and political evil so that we may attain an exalted status of political justice, economic justice, socio-cultural justice. At this stage, we may begin to have a glimpse of politics without bitterness as we move towards total democracy, which has the propensity of leading us to total justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Pelumi. I'm going to now introduce our third panelist, Waliu Ismaila. Waliu Ismaila is a doctoral candidate and graduate instructor in history at West Virginia University. His research focuses on social, military, and welfare history, especially the post-war experience of World War II veterans in Nigeria. Today, Waliu will be presenting a paper titled Cooperative Societies and Modernity in Colonial Nigeria, 1934 to 1960.
All right, thank you very much. I'm Waliu Ismaila, fourth-year PhD candidate from Department of History, West Virginia University. Like some of you be aware, this is my first time of working on areas totally different from my primary research focus, World War II veterans. And that will lead me to my motivation for this paper. My motivation derived from my reading of Terence Ranger's The Invention of African Tradition, and alongside that, Thomas Spear's Neo-Traditionalism, the myth of invention. And to make sense of these two conflicting arguments, while I was at the Library of Congress in January, so I came across a particular report on the introduction of cooperative societies in Nigeria, and I thought it wise to use this particular report to make sense of Thomas Spear's and Terence Ranger's conflicting argument on modernity in Africa.
Check whether it's on. Check the side. Check the side. The other side. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'll go straight to the problem of the study. All right, so Eurocentric literature has for too long, through the neo-traditional school, amplified the notion that imperialism modernized Africa. And in the course of my reading, I also identified that this argument has shaped African scholarship for so long that pre-colonial institutions are often derided to advance the colonizers as agents of African modernity. And another problem I identify is that colonialism adapted quite some pre-colonial African traditions to advance colonial development in interwar years, in Nigeria. Still, these pre-colonial traditions have little or no against in existing scholarship, tradition like the Susu, the Ajo thrift system, rotational farm labor system in colonial Nigeria. So then cooperative society was actually introduced in Nigeria in 1935, because that was when officially the colonial authorities issued an ordinance for the introduction of cooperative societies in Nigeria. But the journey to this ordinance began in 1933. That was when colonial officer C.F. Strickland suggested to the colonial authorities in Nigeria the need to introduce the metropolitan European cooperative society tradition in the Nigerian colony. So in December 1933, C.F. Strickland, a British colonial officer, issued a memo informing colonial authorities about the significance of introducing cooperative societies, a European tradition for enhancing socioeconomic development in Nigeria. So by November 1933 and through January 1934, Strickland had visited several districts in southern Nigeria. So the mandated Cameroons and northern Nigeria for an ethnographic study on the workability of cooperatives and the possible responses of Africans towards the idea. So Strickland believed that if progress was well conceived, cooperation among Africans should aim at economic and social improvement. So cooperation, according to Strickland, was more like a socio-economic agency. He believed that such an agency was crucial for African economic and social development, and alluded to the successes of the initiative in India and Southeast Asia, where he had served as a colonial officer. So by 1934, Strickland has submitted a report to the colonial authorities in Nigeria following his ethnographic study of several districts across northern and southern protectorates. And in his judgment, cooperative societies will be prosperous more in northern and western Nigeria. Still, he doubted his possibility in eastern Nigeria, where during his interaction with some eyewitnesses, he realized that the rural classes are so suspicious as to be almost unapproachable, while others refer to the capacity of the Ibibios and the Igbos to combine for everyday actions, and extremely hopeful of their successes in implementing cooperation. So despite the negative review from Eastern Nigeria, he argued that the situation in Asia was far more complex compared to the attitude of Africans in Eastern Nigeria towards cooperative. So he, however, in the report made a case for the workability of cooperative among the people of Eastern Nigeria. So again, alluding to the complex situation in Arabia and the Palestine, where he claimed that the people were afflicted by faction and that Nigeria possessed more economic sense than the Malays. So by 1935, the colonial authorities in Nigeria, issued this cooperative society ordinance to mobilize subjects across the Nigerian colony for socio-economic development. So by 1936, So by 1936, cooperative registrar E.G. Hague reported to the district office that the Igbo people, for example, in Owerri province, both among the farmers and some intelligentsia, popularly supported the idea of cooperation. So the argument was that savings groups and clubs, otherwise referred to as Esusu, existed well among the Igbos, and that Igbos in the district were open to cooperation. So I'll go straight to my argument now. So I wouldn't want to bore you more with my narratives here. So my key argument is that although the colonial administration introduced the British metropolitan tradition of cooperative society into Nigeria in interwar years, but it adapted the indigenous guild system and organization to mobilize the literate and non-literate class for colonial development. And my second argument is that considering the global reality of the interwar period and economic situation in Europe, cooperative societies were actually introduced amid the economic depression of the 1930s to cushion the effect of global capitalism on both the British metropolitan and colonial economies. So against the notion of savior demonstrated by colonial officer C.F. Strickland, which was that cooperation was needed to ensure economic discipline and productive spending among Africans. So the British colonial authorities organized craft organization to ease capital accumulation and extraction of African resources in large production for metropolitan exports. And I have a few findings to buttress some of these arguments I'm making. And I realized that in 1935, for example, the Palm Produce Association in southern province of Nigeria organized themselves into a cooperative society, because they believe, the idea was actually not new to them, so it was kind of easier for them to blend with the colonial authorities on that. But also in 1935, cocoa farmers in Abeokuta, for example, objected the idea because they believe it was an indirect way for the colonial authorities to poke nose into their private life, get the hang of their, income history, and as a result could propel them to increase their taxes. So in Abeokuta, for example, they were, cocoa farmers were kind of reluctant towards that cooperation. So in 1936, the cooperative registrar, like I said earlier on, reported, to the district office that Igbo people in Owerri province, both among the farmers and some intelligentsia, popularly supported their cooperation. So I also discovered that in 1945, the colonial authorities in Nigeria initiated the Nigerian Local Development Board Ordinance. So this ordinance, what this ordinance entails is that whoever was ready to join any corporation or establish a firm that could contribute to colonial development, this board will make available grants and loans or both, grant or loan or both. So unfortunately, the colonial authorities could not provide grants and loans to farmers, and it kind of threatened the workability of it kind of threatened the colonial development plans, in the aftermath of World War II, for example. So and it was in light of this ordinance that World War II soldiers, for example, also banded themselves together and established the Nigerian Ex-Servicemen Company, in the hope that they could establish ex-servicemen home where where members will be trained in the art of shoemaking, blacksmithing, and all of that. So, but unfortunately, too, I realized that to support my second argument, I realized that colonial authorities, with the little resources available then, kind of made those grants available to cocoa farmers because they realized they could make more, from them, and realizing how profitable cocoa was then, it could as well aid metropolitan economies, because Europe then was actually, trying to recover from the impact of World War II. So soldiers were actually neglected because they felt, their actions might not have direct benefit to the metropolitan economies. So, that was why, ex-servicemen cooperative society, to a large extent, was kind of, threatened, in the aftermath of World War II, or why the colonial authorities could not do more to support the ex-servicemen cooperative society. I'll go next. I'll go to my sources. I really want to explain my sources a little bit, and to frame my analysis, I've been exploring colonial reports on cooperative societies, annual report of the Nigerian Local Development Board, annual report of the general progress of development and welfare scheme. I'm also exploring archival files on cooperative societies in Nigeria, which I actually collected from Enugu and Ibadan. For now, I've not been able to explore the northern archives in Nigeria, Enugu archive, Kaduna archives specifically. And for the ex-servicemen cooperative, society, I'm currently working with some Colonial newspaper reports from West African Pilot and Daily Times. So to restate my argument and tentative conclusion now, because it's a work in progress. So using Nigerian's case, I argue that colonialism was not simply a unilateral political phenomenon. And I also argue that colonial authorities in Nigeria sought to incorporate pre-existing polities with their own structures of authority and political processes into incorporate pre-existing policies with their own structures of authority and political processes into colonial structures. And in the process, they themselves develop in response to local conditions. As you all know, this paper is a work in progress. I'm still struggling with, my data interpretation. So I really appreciate your contribution on how to, go about this, make these ideas more coherent, for my draft and article. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wale. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our last but not the least panelist, Dr. Adewumi Damilola Adebayo is an assistant professor at the Department of History at York University, Toronto, Canada. He's a historian of West Africa, particularly Nigeria. His current research investigates the socio-economic life of Western technologies in Africa since the 1850s. Today, Dr. Damilola is presenting a paper titled Reforming the Unreformable, ? Historical Perspectives on Electricity Privatization in Nigeria, 1909 to 1985.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mba, for the introduction. I'll just wait a little while for my slides to come up on the screen because it's really important that I use it for this talk. But I should say, whilst waiting for the slide, that the paper that I'm presenting today is an offshoot of my ongoing book manuscript on the history of electrification in Nigeria's urban centers since the mid-19th century. And I aim to make this particular paper a contribution to ongoing debates in Nigeria on the privatization of the power sector. And my premise is that ideas for power sector reforms in Nigeria, as proposed by energy economists and policymakers, are primarily derived from the privatization experiences of other African and Asian countries. There are some merits to importing models from countries that have overcome similar challenges to Nigeria. However, I am arguing that significant lessons can be learned from how colonial and early post-colonial governments have addressed inefficiencies in the power sector. The paper is a work in progress. The end game is to make it either an epilogue to the book, to make the history that I'm writing speak to the present, or a standalone long form article in an energy policy outlet. So it's not designed as a traditional article, since I'm trying to contribute to ongoing debates instead. So your feedback will be sincerely appreciated. Now, the Nigerian power sector has been partially privatized since 2011. Private companies together with the states, allowed to generate electricity, as you can see in the charts, from thermal and renewable sources, including hydro. The electric current generated by these companies are then fed into the Transmission Corporation of Nigeria, the Transmission Company of Nigeria, which is a completely state-owned enterprise. And then the energy is then sold in bulk to DISCOs, distribution companies, who supply everyday consumers and then collect tariffs, the rates. The consensus at the moment is that complete privatization would end corruption and inefficient services in the power sector. However, there are challenges to full privatization. These challenges include limited due diligence on private companies seeking to acquire state-owned enterprise and excessive state intervention in price setting, amongst others that you can see on the screen. So all of these challenges have made Nigeria's former finance minister, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, to describe the Nigerian economy and past public sector as unreformable, right? To use the word unreformable in a book. So what can we learn from history, right? And is privatization even the best solution to the current issues in the Nigerian power sector? It is important to note that electricity supply commenced in Nigeria in 1898, and unlike many colonial territories, electrification was the business of the state in colonial Nigeria to a large extent. And I'm happy to explain the practical and ideological basis of public sector management of electricity in Nigeria, if anyone is interested. Allegations of public sector inefficiencies are at the roots of every call for the privatization of the Nigerian electricity sector since the early 20th century. So the first documented call for privatization was made by one Frederick Williams Dove in 1909. Is Yoruba man previous from Sierra Leone, migrated from Sierra Leone. Anyways, Dove proposed that the power plants in Lagos should be put in the hand of a private company to improve the efficiency of its operation. He contended that the colonial government could afford to be lazy, to be lackadaisical about efficient street lighting because the state was not responsible to private shareholders. The colonial government, of course, rebuffed this initial privatization attempt, and I am actually currently revising a full-length commentary on Dove's economic thought during this period. I have a full-length paper on him alone. I'm happy to explain why I think is a big deal in the history of Nigerian economic thought, and why his thought on privatization is critical, considering that during this period, other African nationalists were actually seeking additional government investment in electrification. During the late 1920s, the Lagos Power Station, the Lagos Undertaking, which is the sole focus of my argument because Lagos was the initial site of electrification and it remains the most important center of electricity consumption in Nigeria to date. The Lagos station became profitable during the late 1920s with more room for expansion. Again, I'm happy to explain that if anyone is interested. Due to that profitability, an attempt was made by a British company to acquire the undertaking to take it over, but the proposal was turned down by the Secretary of State. It had an ideological underpinning due to events happening in Britain at the time. The British electricity industry was also undergoing a process of nationalization, which was completed after the British general election of 1945, when the Labour Party won that election. So I'm still researching the aborted privatization attempt, but I do know for now that it had two interrelated consequences. The first was that when the government was entertaining the company's proposal to buy the Lagos Undertaking, the state was mandated to prepare an annual statement for Lagos right? And by extension, the entire Nigerian power sector. The annual statement was to follow a proper private sector accounting procedure. And that was the very first time that the Lagos undertaking, and by extension, the Nigerian electricity sector was subjected to that proper annual reporting. And so we know since 1930, when that first report was published, the reports gave us a rich corpus of micro level data for the Nigerian electricity industry. And I do have the reports for every year from 1933 up until 1972, with missing years, of course, as you would expect. Some of those reports I got from Ibadan, some from Kaduna, some from the British Library, some from the Library of Congress. I was really surprised to find them in all of these places scattered all over, because I thought I would only find I only found a few in the first instance, and then whilst I was doing research on other themes, I found others in the later years. Unfortunately, since the 1970s, the frequency and the quality of the reports have decreased. The second consequence that the initial attempt to take over the Lagos power sector had was that from 1931, deductions from the annual gross profit also included the idea of sustainability. So in other words, from 1931, an allowance was made for depreciation and sinking fund, which was important because that would mean that the state would no longer be required to make significant annual financial commitment to the Lagos power sector. Another response of the government to that initial privatization attempt was a comprehensive review of the electricity sector. The state introduced a new set of policies codified in the Electricity Ordinance of 1929, the initial one on the left. And in October 1930, the colonial government made the first regulation under that 1929 ordinance to regulate electricity prices in Lagos. The key feature of that policy was a general reduction in the rates, in the charges, and the introduction of new and more precise consumer categories. Additional regulations consolidated the monopoly status of the government in the electricity sector, and only two major private suppliers whose interests aligned with that of the colonial government were allowed to operate. And that include a company known as NESCO, operating in the Just Tin mines in northern Nigeria, and the African Timber and Plywood Company owned by the United African Company in Sapele in the Niger Delta. And at independence in 1960, the EC and the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria managed about 82% of Nigeria's total installed capacity, whilst the private sector was responsible for the remaining 18% at the time. Although the electricity sector has largely remained a public enterprise, calls for increased efficiency, right, triggered reforms. So during the colonial period, and each time there was a call for privatization, right, it would trigger certain reforms, significant reforms. Scholars have continued to assume that corruption associated with public cooperation in Africa or in Nigeria in particular is to be blamed for poor electricity supply. However, since 2011, the sector has been partially privatized and the energy crisis persists. For a country with a population of over 200 million, Nigeria generates less than 5,000 megawatts. In comparison, South Africa, which has 52 million people, generates over 42,000. And South Africa still has a lot of problems that, for those following the news, would know. And what that basically means in practical terms is that the average South African actually uses 30 times more energy than the average Nigerian. The question is, who should invest in electrification and who is best positioned to manage it? Right. Many African countries at independence adopted a state-led model of socioeconomic progress codified in development plans. The political will and capacity of African states to pursue economic development were kneecapped starting from the late 1960s by corruption, military coups, and other issues. My argument again, is that to argue that the post-colonial state is incapable of investing efficiently in electrification because of the challenges of the public cooperation model is to throw away the baby with the bathwater, right? Privatization became a buzzword in many African states during the early 1980s due to the influence of the World Bank and the IMF-inspired structural adjustment programs. And I contend that public investment is actually indispensable to improving current electrification rates in Nigeria. And this is from basic economics of investments. Because electricity is fundamental to economic development, but investments are often unprofitable, at least in the short run. Right? When you're making large-scale investment, they're often unprofitable. So public investments are necessary and justified for projects with a time horizon that are too long for the markets to handle them efficiently. So in other words, any investment with a break-even period that is longer than a typical commercial bank credit payback period cannot be financed by private equity alone. Nigeria needs over 63,000 megawatts of new generation. No company will be willing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars only to wait for 50 years before they begin to make profits. Their immediate response would always be to increase the energy rates beyond the capacity of the average citizen. Right. So back to the main, and I am not proposing that the current government should reintroduce colonial era policies that can stifle private enterprise or renationalize the electricity industry. But with a massive energy deficit, there is ample opportunities for new public investments in electrification that would complement existing private sector-led efforts. And in making such new investments, the government would do well to learn some positive history lessons. A first step would be to reduce information asymmetry, right? By providing comprehensive and audited periodic financial statements of public investment revenues and expenditures, and by preparing a report on the current state of the plants and the transmission and distribution systems. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to introduce our discussant, Dr. Tara Hollis, who is a visiting assistant professor of African history at Macalester College, St. Paul, Minnesota. And Dr. Tara, please say more about yourself. Sure. And then go ahead.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Tara Hollies. My research focuses on southeastern Nigeria, particularly Igbo land, in the transition from autonomous Igbo society into colonial society at the turn of the 20th century. I look at women's roles, in particularly in proactive and reactive protests to colonial incursions. And so I actually see a lot of comparisons and important threads that are related to my own work in each of your presentations for today. So I have a few general thoughts, and then I'll go into comments and questions for each person. So I see that each one of you on this panel has really important topics that examine a range of political and social issues from the past and present, but really the thrust of them is that there are implications for the future of Nigeria that are really important. We need to look at these lessons from the past to try to move forward to make a better political economy and in general, I think, society for Nigeria. So I'll go in the order that they were presented. So Oliver, I'll start with you. You don't have to respond to my comments right now. These are things that you can think about. So you examined a little, analyzed situation, the roles of the 100,000 plus West African military personnel in India beyond their military presence or their military obligations. And so you're really trying to point to the diversity of the experiences of those West African military personnel. And I think you're seeking to fill this gap in historiography that goes beyond just seeing the military personnel as military. And I think that's really important. I'm a social and cultural historian, so I believe that is really important to understand. But I think what you can do is even push further and make more explicit the significance of why we need to look at these social cultural histories. Why is it important that we look at military personnel beyond just their role in military service? Like, what does that do for our understanding of cross ethnic and cross national relationships. So between the different groups of people from West Africa in India, what are these connections that they're forging, and why is that so significant to social and cultural histories? I think you can even push that further because I see it as important, but I think that's something that you can further explain. Okay, next up is Pelumi. So I love that you privilege the historical fiction and novels and the importance of this to understanding historical memory. I use historical fiction in my own work, so I definitely saw this as crossing into some things that I look at. I look at more of the East rather than like Lagos in the West, but I still think this is really important. One thing I think that you could explore further is, what is it about historical fiction? What is it about novels in particular in this media that you says creates and recreates memories? But what is it about the novel and the fictionalizing historical events and giving more of that lived experience that gives us that sense of remembering things that happened, but then creating maybe like a deeper sense of connection to it, whether it's traumatic or whether it's meant to heal the trauma. And then beyond that, are there other media besides the novels and then the oral poetry that you mentioned that are also used in memory creation and recreation? I'm thinking like songs, maybe like, I don't know, like the highlight genre, but also more common or more recent hip hop culture. You've got like people like Burna Boy who have stuff with like political protest music. Are there any connections there, even like are things like today, like social media or op-eds in newspapers from the 90s until now? Is there anything that you see other sources that are doing this like memory creation and recreation work? So that's what I would suggest that you really highlight what is it about the novels and the oral poetry that is doing this work and why maybe other sources can't do this, but then consider what other sources there might be for the memory creation. And then Walu, for you, I think it's really important that you're pointing to the complexities and the nuances of, can't read my own handwriting. Of negotiating colonial institutions. So where certain groups or individuals might accept these cooperatives as they're imposed by the British regime, or how they're changed slightly, or potentially, completely rejected or resisted by certain people. I think you speak to the nuances because this idea of the invention of tradition, which has been long debated for decades, something I actually look at in my own work too. And I think it is more complicated than just saying rejected or accepted or something that's wholly indigenous or wholly invented. It's much more complex. And you're pointing to this really important point that it is complex. One question I have for you is, do you historicize why you mentioned that these cooperatives that the British imposed starting in the 1930s worked out much better in the West and the North than they did in the East? So do you historicize why that is? This is only a few years after the Women's War of 1929 in southeastern Nigeria. And I wonder if the resistance or hesitance to accept these cooperatives based on the European model had anything to do with the laws that came out, I want to say in 1933, in the colonial reforms that stated specifically that they banned self-help groups. So this was meant to like try to put down Igbo and Ibibio women's resistance of like collective punishment, which is essentially what they did during the Women's War. Does that lead into any like resistance to these cooperatives? If they're saying we can have self-help groups that were indigenous, but we can have self-help groups that are the British, based on the British model, were there any people who were calling out the hypocrisy of that? That's something to consider. Yeah, and then I would also suggest that you further examine the specific elements of the indigenous societies that were incorporated into these cooperatives. You mentioned that there were ways that the British tried to incorporate indigenous aspects into these cooperatives, but did that look different in Yoruba land or Edo land or Igbo land, even within like a fairly close regional area? Were there differences based on ethnicity or other political ties? So those are things to consider. And then last but not least, Damilola, I really appreciate your pointing to the lessons that we can learn for today based on history. I think this is really important. So this is clearly a big issue. I would argue it's one of the most serious issues that is plaguing Nigeria today, is this inefficiency of the power system. And I'm not a political economist, so some of the stuff is a little bit maybe like above what I understand. But one question I had is, if the debate is so focused on financial aspects and the private versus public, and you're saying that this won't solve it, even if we go full privatization, we'll still be falling short of the amount of energy we need to produce so that all the Nigerian citizens can have power. So if it's not that, have you considered other factors that maybe would affect, would I guess enable more power to be dispersed to more people, thinking about like different types of energy production, hydro, wind, solar, other things like that? Do any of those other, I guess, these different types of production factor into getting more energy to more people? And I don't know what the cost effectiveness would be for each of those, but is that something that you've seen maybe in other West African states? So I know you mentioned South Africa, but I'm wondering like Ghana or Senegal or other areas in West Africa that have more efficient power systems. Have you seen, like, is it not just about privatization versus public, but is it about the different types of energy that's being produced and dispersed? So that was something that I think that you could explore further if you wanted to. Thank you again for sharing your papers with me. I really enjoyed reading them and hearing you guys present them today. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. I don't know if someone is monitoring the online system for questions, and can let me know when we have questions in the chat, and maybe read those out, and then you can read those out. But I'll open it up to the audience for questions and comments. Well, and then in the meantime, please, you can respond to Tara's.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, yeah. Thank you very much for the kind of engagement with the paper. And I think this is a very important point. I mean, yeah, they're two different things. I think at one level, there are different kinds of affinities that are partly encouraged by the British military and partly occur in India, particularly around religion, particularly around Muslims from northern Ghana and northern Nigeria, who are encouraged to feel at home in India by the British authorities to identify with Muslims in North India, supposedly because of the Ummah, or Global Brotherhood of Muslims, which is a political colonial project. So there's that kind of identity, but then there is also there's certainly a negotiation and a hardening of town and sub-ethnic identities in among African troops overseas, but the source base is mainly at a general level where it's possible to only really locate it in isolated examples occurring in sources, because in general, colonial officials who generate much source material are unaware of these associations. But associational life is common in overseas military service, such as like the Young Man of Ijabu Association of Soldiers, and so on and so forth. So it's a very good point, but the source material is kind of not ideal about the ethnic affiliations.
You want to respond?
So, all right, I'll take your comment as contribution and not even a question, because I wasn't thinking about the abandonment riot, dimension, and to understand if the introduction of cooperative societies and the eventual 1935 ordinance was more like a counter reaction to the anti-colonial resistance from that part of Nigeria. So I'll consider that going forward as I continue to make sense of my paper. It didn't occur to me that way. So, and as to whether the specific element of indigenous element, I'm not too sure if I get the second question correctly, but my job to examine the specific element of indigenous element in these cooperative societies, to know if it was actually different in Ibaland, Igbo land, or Hausa land. So I'll also put it into consideration as I continue my data analysis, and I hope that I'll be able to find some of these whether similarities or differences in the pre-existing traditions across this, geopolitical zones or these regions in colonial Nigeria. Yeah.
Yes, please. Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. The first one was, have I considered other factors that could enable the electricity sector to be more efficient beyond the question of finance? Yes, there are alternatives. The most common one that everyone who studies Nigeria knows, generators, portable generators in particular. And according to Brian Larkin, who is an anthropologist at Bernard College, Columbia University, who's currently doing a research on that topic, he actually argues that as of 2015, there were over 150 million generators, portable generators in Nigeria. His words, not mine. 150 million. There were more generators per household. In other words, I mean, for a country of more than 200 million, there were more generators. And it makes sense because people often have generators in their workplaces and a different one in their homes. And then they have a backup generator in case the main one falls. And the other alternatives are solar panels. But the question is sustainability, right? Because the proposal to go off grid, which generators solve, which solar panels solve, they wasn't the problem. In Western societies, for instance, solar panels are complementary. They are not meant to replace the role of the state. And Daniel Jordan Smith, who is also another truly brilliant anthropologist of Nigeria, published a book this year, Every Household a Government or something like that.
Every household its own government.
Every household its own government, which when I was reading the book felt like I was watching a movie on Nigeria because it made sense. Every household provides their own security by erecting fences. Every household provides their own water supply by digging boreholes and wells. Every household provides their own generator, etc. And such kind of proposals that people like Daniel Jordan Smith have studied, some of the alternatives that to reinforcing the role of the state, which I am proposing. I would rather love to see the state not replacing the private sector, but increasing their complementary role at this point in time, because the deficit is just too much for any private equity firm to handle it effectively. Are there other countries with where the state is in charge and things are better? Oh, so many. In West Africa alone, Benin, which is a tiny country that should be part of Nigeria. I didn't say that. Benin, even Togo and Ghana. I mean, these are like small countries. They have electricity industries that are efficient and they're managed by the state. And the electricity is such a fundamental industry that even in war-torn societies, they've managed to keep the lights on, which is kind of surprising, right? I mean, even until I think last week when Russia bombed a critical electricity facility in Ukraine, there was still light in Ukraine. There's still light in Lebanon. I tried to check some of these things online. So they're so critical that it can't be left to the private sector, right? Even every economist from Adam Smith, if you go as far back as the end of the 19th century, every economist from Adam Smith, they recognize critical sectors that can't be fully handled by the private sector, right? And even in recent times, economists, the writers of the Autumn Billion, Paul Collier, and a couple of other guys that I read from time to time, they also continue to recognize the complementary role of the states. And we could cite a counterfactual, well, not exactly counterfactual, we could cite another example drawing from Western societies, right? Even in countries like Germany, where the private sector is really active, there is significant state involvement, especially in the regulatory process, and also in terms of occasional bailouts during severe economic downturns. In the US here, I mean, the electric car industry relies exclusively on government credits, right? Or on government investments, even though these are exclusively private sector owned companies that have made people the richest person in the world, to not name someone. Anyways, but the point I'm trying to make is that the role of the state cannot, in spite of the alternatives, the role of the state cannot be overemphasized. Thank you.
And Pelumi.
Yeah, thank you. I listened to all that the discussant said, and I accept everything she said. I don't have to, she has explained enough. I don't have to add to what she said so that the audience can participate. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish everybody listened to me like that. So questions, yes, please.
Thank you so much for. Are you all hearing?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for this panel. Unfortunately, I missed a presentation by the person online, so I won't be able to make comments on your paper. But I have a question that is kind of general. That is, when we look at what was covered on this panel, there's a lot of things that seem to work in tandem, like the discussant said. But I wonder if we're looking into the future here, or we're looking into the past. So that's a general comment. And my question to the person on the cooperative societies, I wonder how the colonial officer who advised the government determined that Eastern Nigeria will be unsuccessful in implementing cooperative societies. Everybody knows that Igbos are cooperative. How did he miss that? And I wonder also, I want to find out whether it's one of the anthropologists that the government sent into the field. And then just at the end of it all, I want you to speculate. How did the cooperative society's performance eventually prove the colonial officer right or wrong? Because cooperative societies didn't perform very well. I mean, we know that. So, from other studies on the cooperative societies in Western Nigeria, in Northern Nigeria, they didn't do very well. There were issues. Part of which was politics. Once the colonization politics came into hand. For the paper on the military, I missed a part of it, but I wanted to know if you also covered West African military personnel in Burma, and whether the documentary Burma Boy had any accuracy about it. And I'm also wondering, why were the military personnel never acknowledged by the role of the West African personnel, never acknowledged by the British? Why did they not receive their thank you like other personnel? And finally, to my son, my name is Akamu Adebayo. He's Damilola Adebayo. It's actually my nephew. So I want to thank you for the presentation. If I might say so myself, I think you did a great job. Yeah, it's my son. So I want to know, is there a model is there a model private company in Nigeria that works? And is there a model public corporation in Nigeria that works? Is this a systemic issue across the board in Nigeria? Or is the electricity just one big behemoth that could not be, like you said, unreformable? I know you've spoken about it in part already, but I noted that question before you spoke, so I said I will still ask it anyway. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for attending my talk and for your generous feedback. Is there a model of private company? Have you had model of private companies that work? Yes and no. Yes, because we would single out Dangote, for instance, the Dangote conglomerate. However, you probably know more than I do that Dangote relies extensively on government patronage and on securing policies that enables him to be the sole player in any industry sector he finds himself by executing sharp prices, especially lowering prices below what the competitors can bear. And then once the competitors once their companies go into bankruptcy, it then raises costs sharply, right? It does that all the time to every sector, except one where it wasn't successful. The Nodo company, where they had to go out to he had to sell to the Indomie company. There are other examples that there are too numerous to mention of private companies that work in Nigeria that do not rely on government patronage. But again, there's a need for I'm not sure how best to put it. There's a need for because it's impossible, for instance, for one thing that wants to effect a national change. They only function in their local area, right? In their state or in the city where they're operating. So it's an unending question, obviously. Is there a model public corporation that works? The answer is not so simple. We know from recent history, from the Lagos State example, under the former governor, particularly Babatunde Fashola, that during his time as governor between 2007 and 2015, the public corporations in Lagos were efficient. So the problem that I have seen, and I could be wrong, but I think there is some truth to it. The problem that I've seen is that the system is designed around strong people as opposed to an efficient system that can run without strong men. They're usually men. So yeah, without strong men. So automatically then answers the next question that it's a systemic issue. It's not just electricity, but it's just that the electricity industry is fundamental to everything else, every other thing, from security to food production to even water supply to education. The electricity industry is really, really significant. In the electricity, in other studies on electricity, there is a lot of emphasis on how street lights in the 1940s have enabled school children to learn, especially in rural environments where people cannot afford to install domestic lights in their own homes. But without street lights, the road also becomes impassable, right? Cases of kidnaps that are getting worse by the day. without electricity, even the security architecture, the powerhouse where the things work would not work. Even electricity companies use generators, right? I mean, it's the irony where you go to power companies that are running on generators. So it's the electricity system is basically representative of a larger systemic issue. It's only that if we can get that fixed, it would have a ripple effect on the other sector. And the first comment that you made for everyone, is this a question of the future or is this a question of the past? The chair gave a simple answer, which I'm going to repeat. And he used the Ghanaian Adinkra symbol, Sankofa, which is more like infinity, right? The past rolling into the present and into the future and all of that. And I made a note here about history lessons, something that I said earlier, and it's the power of history and the power of historians to influence policies over time. I'm currently reading a book by Priya Satya based in Stanford, who is exploring how historians and the British in Britain have actually functioned in significant policy making offices, capacities. The most notably Winston Churchill, for instance, who was a historian himself. So the power of history and historians to influence policies is something that we need to acknowledge. And it's also a question of the relevance of history in the 21st century. And as I noted earlier, it's meant to be like an epilogue or a contribution to current debates, which is somewhat different from what I'm really, it's more like an epilogue to the book I'm writing. It's not really integral to the argument of the book, which can take forever to talk about. Thank you. Thank you so much once again.
All right, thank you very much, Prof, for that question. I was also kind of worried that, when I read Strickland ethnographic report and its suggestion to the colonial authorities in Nigeria. And, the contradiction became, more apparent when I juxtaposed his report with the cooperative register, that's EFG8. When I juxtaposed it with his in 1936 report, and in the report, it kind of demonstrated that what Igbo people, particularly in Owerri and the Okigwe district, were kind of open and receptive to cooperation. So I'm not too sure why Strickland kind of made us sweeping generalizations about the Igbo people, but I think for now, my findings reveal that in Okigwe district, for example, and Owerri province in southern Nigeria, they kind of embraced cooperative society, and that was because they had saving clubs, otherwise referred to as Isusu, already existing in that part of southern Nigeria before cooperative society was actually officially introduced in 1934. And may I also mention that Strickland was a colonial official ethnographer. He had already the British colonial government set up a cooperative societies in India before he later moved to Nigeria to carry out that ethnographic study on how to replicate the Indian model in Nigeria.
I think that it's a good question. Thank you. This paper doesn't consider Burma. I would say that Burma is quite different to India because it's an active theatre of war. And then there is a time which is very rarely covered of African peacekeeping operations in Burma in 1945 and 1946, which is again there's not a parallel elsewhere in the entire war of that episode. So is Burma Boy, the documentary on Al Jazeera about Isaac Fadayebo, is that accurate? Yes, but it's about one person, so it's a bit like trying to tell the story of Pearl Harbor through one person's experience. It doesn't cover very much about an entire episode in the war. And then why did the British not acknowledge the contribution of these personnel? They effectively, because the British the British Army at a kind of central level had not resolved its attitude about using African soldiers in the war. So although it did do that, for example, in Burma, it still wanted to hide or deny in many cases that it did so, apart from in certain examples like colonial forces that exclusively worked with African soldiers who did acknowledge it, but they tended to do it later, and they were not influential enough in the central army to get like an army-wide acknowledgement of that. But you're completely right, and it's worth saying that the activities of West African soldiers were often left off battle rolls, which were documents that recorded the achievements of soldiers in battle in the British Army.
Okay, I guess I will ask just one question to Dr. Coates. So studies of the experiences of African soldiers in the Americas, like say in the Haitian Revolution, show that British policy of colonial Black soldiering showed greater respect and provided more material, paraphernalia, boots, shoes, the form of dressing, and a system of recognition and promotion than the French did. The reverse seems to be the case in West Africa. So when we look at, for example, the experience of the Senegalese versus the experience of Nigerian soldiers. Do you have any theory?
Yeah, I think there's I think possibly what one thing that counts for this is that there was it was not possible for the Free French military forces to successfully hide the participation of African troops, because African troops served in metropolitan France, and it was not possible to completely hide that. However, the Free French did try to erase the contribution of African soldiers from the liberation of Paris, where Charles de Gaulle deliberately pursued a policy that was termed blanchissement or whitening, which meant that he did not want African soldiers to be marching down the street of Paris when it was liberated. So these African soldiers were put in the south of France in camps where it was hoped they'd be away from the public eye. So I'm kind of cautious about the idea that the French army was a success story, or in that case. It's just that they couldn't successfully hide the presence of African soldiers inside France. There were African soldiers working in French villages, dating French women in French villages, and it was not possible to hide that.
Okay. So, any more questions for? Okay, one more question.
Thank you for the presentation, Sonny. Really, the whole thing. I want to ask Dr. Debayo. I know you've been asked the question and you've answered. I really want to ask you. On the issue of electricity, what we can infer from private enterprise or can be the solution. I also know that apart from industry that something like Colonial University, University, we have kind of measure of the groups. I think it's Eastlands where I think Colonial is in 1999 to now, it hasn't really any far out with all that. Then I want to ask, is there any way you can incorporate these, even though it cannot be a kind of sustainable thing for the whole national entity? Maybe it can be effects of maybe having maybe state by state or improving and that. Then apart from that, I also know that in the economic trade, nations do this reverse engineering, how they come to other nations, how to get the policies. Is it Can we have something like that in Nigeria and see how that can work the rest
Thank you. The second question is funny because it reminds me of a recent event in Nigeria. I can't remember the sector in particular where it was discovered that the policy document was a copy and paste from Singapore.
Right. Yeah.
Like including the errors, like including where Singaporean localities like were mentioned, right? And it was standard at the Senate, right? So you have this kind of funny examples that are almost impossible to believe, right? Wole Soyinka once stated when he was granting an interview for his recent novel, Chronicles of the Happiest People on Earth, that anytime he thinks of an absurd reality that he wants to write about, he just needs to wait a day or two and then he would read about something even worse in the newspapers. And he's wondering whether his imagination is even falling short of the reality. Now, with regards to the first question, which I think is more important, thanks once again. Redeemers University, the Redemption Camp, the Lagos Ibadan Expressway axis, which has been studied by historians, scholars of religion, and urbanity, have a lot of standalone large-scale enterprise, if I can call those ventures enterprise, right? They're religious institutions and bodies, and they've been off the grid for, in some cases, decades. But then again, you're reiterating the problem because it's like assuming that the state we're basically saying the state is incapable of supplying basic infrastructure and basic needs, and people should do it by themselves. Then the question arises, why then do workers pay taxes? If every household is their own government, why then should taxes be paid? Do you get a point? And if you consider that this is a contemporary issue, the 2023 election is almost here. One of the frontliners is someone who is notorious for implementing, for raising funds through repressive tax regimes, right? Taxing everything like he did in Lagos to raise funds, right? So and he's already promising to do something like that to increase the internally generated revenues within Nigeria. And so if we're going to support such kind of a model where the government needs to increase the revenue, and at the same time, we're supporting a model where every household is their own government, then it becomes difficult for me to reconcile it in my mind on a theoretical level. On a practical level, of course, if I were to build a house in Nigeria, I would go off grid, right? Because no one can rely on the state to provide basic infrastructure. But at the same time, as far as the future of the country is concerned, and as far as drawing useful lessons, positive history lessons, the negative ones, positive history lessons are concerned, the state can do more and has the capacity to do more if and only if they resolve the fundamental challenges. No, private sector companies were basically buying regional distribution companies, right? There's an Abuja electricity distribution company. I was going to use an image, but I thought if I use that particular image, it also speaks to something else. Dr. Kali Coates talked about the Shango statue in front of NEPA, and I thought, wow, that's powerful imagery. But I don't want to go into like the religious symbolism and all of those things because it's away from this topic. But you would have seen that it's called a co-distribution company now. When these private sector companies bought over government enterprise, it was like, I'm going to use a Nigerian example, please pardon me. I'm sorry. It was like the way people buy clothes in Katangwa markets, like where you just carry a sack. Whatever you find inside is what you get, all right? You just buy in bulk. You don't know what is inside. I hope you guys can understand that example. That's the only example I can think of where you buy used clothes by the sack. You don't know what they contain. You don't know what's inside. It's only when you get them that you decide that you get lucky, and then you might sell one shirt for the price of the entire sack. So that's what they did, because there is no financial statement that is even available in the public sector, available in the public rather. There is no financial statement. There is no the state of the national grid. No one actually really knows what's happening. In fact, on many occasions, when there is a surge in water supply, like rainfall and all of that in Kanji Dam, the Kanji Dam hydroelectric company is able to generate more than 5,000 megawatts, but the transmission company is unable to receive because of the problems with the transmission system. So to then say, let's give up on the state completely, I don't think, personally, I don't think if we are going to do that, then let's just go full scale anarchy, right? I mean, of course, I am going extreme here, pardon me, but I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say, that if the state must function and exercise its right as the state, then there is a need for the state to fulfill its own end of the social contract beyond preserving rights and liberties and all of those things to providing infrastructure that on which the economy would then survive and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll end it on that excellent note. So please join me in thanking our panelists and our discussants. Thank you to our excellent discussant, Dr. Tara.